How are you doing today, Dem?
I am a person.
You are a person?
Yes.
You sure?
I am. I
I
am
feel like
positive. Yes.
did we talk about this last podcast? You sure? I might have to test you.
Okay. Do a Turing test.
I just today was listening over some of the recording of the last podcast for the listeners. It has not been edited yet. And I remember we didn't recall any of the characters' names. So I was like, for the description, I'm going to have to make a key. And
Yeah,
so
then automatically insert it. Oh, I can do. I can do cards like. Uh, Anytime we mention a character that we don't know, I can record a little thing like, please see note 1.
yeah, edit in their actual name.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'll just do that, and then retroactively, if people listen to number 5, then they know what happened.
What things should we talk about today?
Well, I have bought a couple of new robots, and I might want to talk
Really?
about those. Yeah. So I do electronic design. And,
Really?
Yeah.
You've never brought this up.
Yes, I have absolutely never brought this up in like 2 of the 4 podcasts. Oh, 3, I guess now. The main thing I do is electronic design, as in making schematics and PCBs. And one of the more time-consuming, I guess, things is populating PCBs with components. So for those people who are not familiar with this process, what you do is you've got a bare board, which is like a plastic board with copper traces on it and some exposed tinned pads. And then you apply what is called solder paste. It has the consistency of peanut butter, but it's actually like tin and lead and other things in very, very tiny balls in like a matrix of some kind of flux. So you apply that on specific locations where you want to put components. And then, in my case, I manually, with like tweezers, I pull out a tiny little component from a tray and then put it on the correct position. And you can imagine these components, some of them are about 1 by 1.5 millimeters. So in inches, that's 1/20th of an inch. So if you squeeze your tweezers slightly too hard, then that component goes flying and you will literally never be able to find it back.
I feel like you should just record yourself doing this, because listening to you right now, it sounds exactly like a voiceover of someone tinkering. Exactly.
I have a
It just
I have a recording of a video recording of
like
this.
I was thinking, is he doing this right now? I don't hear anything else. Like,
I'll include in the YouTube.
yeah, throw it in.
Yeah. This process is kind of boring and error prone, so I decided to buy what is called a pick and place machine, which does the picking and placing automatically. And this is the coolest robot I've ever bought. It's exactly the same as every other robot. So I also have a CNC milling machine, a 2.5D machine, and I've got a 3D printer. And all of these things are just some kind of head that can move in the X, Y, and Z direction, right? But this one has cameras. So usually what you would expect with a robot is you program a robot to do an exact move. So you say, this is where you have to pick up a component, this is exactly where you have to put it, and then the robot just does that movement. That's how normal robots work. But this one, it has cameras, and it goes and searches your component. You can give it a designated area where you can just toss all the components, and then it just goes there and it looks around. It kind of goes back and forth, sees, oh, there is a component, moves there, rotates it in the right orientation using another camera, and then puts it in the right place. That is so awesome! That is the best robot I've ever had, and now I want everything to have vision.
Well, I feel like we both know what has to happen. You just need to have a couple-hour recording of you working with your robot to go over the podcast.
I will be making a video of this. I'll make like a full-on video with explanation on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/powerelectronicsblog. Oh, I passed 1,000 subscribers.
Oh, nice. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. It's awesome. I'm not quite sure why, but people subscribe to me.
There was recently an election
Yep.
in the U.S. I don't know if anybody has been following this.
I've been heavily following it, and I am now sick of following politics, but happy to talk about democracy.
Oh, it's been fun.
Fun is, I would say, a slight exaggeration. Well, yeah, it's for like real geeks. I don't know how much you enjoy elections and election systems, and like I guess you have to like it a little bit because you have listened to
CGP Grey. Yeah, I'm not even sure if so much I am more interested in those topics or in just hearing CGP Grey talk about them. I would say they are interesting to an extent. So, Democracy Corner. I just took a piece out of my chair. It's fine. This is my form of fiddling.
You just took a bite, or how does this work?
It's like sometimes you remove a screw or something. I would first preface it by saying, abstract this from whatever is going on in the real world, and we'll just talk about it in the possible properties that you would want out of your election system.
Yeah, so a lot of people who discuss this, they either shy away completely from every practical aspect of this, just to avoid naming anybody. For instance, CGP Grey did the video with the yellow party and the purple party and that kind of stuff, which was very obviously the UK elections. He just took the results of that, and you could call it anonymized it, but it wasn't really anonymous. So I just like to preface this by saying we're obviously talking about the Trump versus Clinton election in the US, but that's just the most visible example of this and why this is on our minds. But there are so many countries with similar first past the post or first past the post-ish systems and two-party systems, or even single-party systems, which is essentially a dictatorship. Doesn't always have to be a classical dictatorship. But fundamentally, the first thing I say about this is tyranny of the majority is an inherent issue with any non-representational system. That's just how it works.
Yeah, pretty much.
And
it's the winner take all.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically, you're going to have, if you have winner take all for anything, you're gonna have the tyranny of some group.
Yeah.
It's like
and it's either going to be a majority or a plurality.
Yeah.
And none of those, like a plurality is arguably even worse. In an effective two-party system like the US, the majority isn't even the majority, like 50.5% of people, and it's really something like that, right? It's like it swings around like a couple tenths of a percent. That's not actually everybody who fully agrees with their choice. That is only maybe 10% of people are like 100% behind Donald Trump in this case, or Hillary Clinton for that matter. And the rest are in the middle, leaning towards, some maybe leaning a bit more, some a bit less. But essentially the largest part by far of the population will be to some extent discontent.
That almost seems like completely self-contained and stops the conversation there. What exactly would you want from a democracy? And
I enjoy that question. It's often asked, and I'm sorry for monologuing here, but I really like this subject. the concept of saying something is a democracy, there's this
At least in
spectrum,
America,
right?
it's become a buzzword.
Yeah, America spreads democracy around the world.
Democracy, yeah. It's
The steward of democracy.
I don't know. People should think of it as really there are families of democracies. It's a class of.
It's arguably it's a class. Arguably, yeah. There are even people who argue to say that true democracy, that any system is some proportional mix of democracy, oligarchy, and to some extent other systems as well. Like you can have a partial dictatorship, which is the U.S. U.S. has executive power, which is dictatorship, fundamentally.
Yeah.
Like one person, essentially. I know this is not exactly how it works, but one person essentially can
do some stuff.
Yeah, do in a limited sense can do certain stuff, which in no parliamentary system would be possible, right? Like this does not exist in Europe, for instance, even the UK.
Interesting. I wish there were more words for these things.
Yeah.
Because everything like dictatorship, oligarchy, democracy has been so
tainted,
emotionally charged.
Yeah.
And just these words have been
yeah
crumbling under.
I don't mean these words with their emotional context, by the way.
Yeah, I know you don't mean that. But I just find it sad that this is what happens to most words over time.
Yeah.
But that's a different subject. What are the basic property that everybody says constitutes a democracy is equal representation of the people in some form or another.
Yeah.
What would you have to say about that? It's let's just say in lieu of this idea of tyranny of the majority.
This is going to be another monologue. I profusely apologize in advance for taking up so much of the airtime.
I'm in interview mode right now.
Yeah, I guess. So I really like this idea. This has been put forward by a couple of people. I really enjoy how, for instance, Noam Chomsky, who is like a divisive person, let me just put it that way, he puts it like a democracy or any kind of way of government is in a lot of ways an instrument to limit change, so and limit the rate of change especially. So what you want to do is if you have an idea for new legislation or for something that would pertain to most people, you have to propose this idea to some institution, and then that institution has everybody look over it and then sends it to another institution who has the power to veto it or amend it or whatever, and then send it to another institution, and then maybe after a year in some form your idea may come to pass or fail. And the idea is that if you don't have these kinds of institutions that slow stuff down, the good part is that somebody who has the best in view for the country will be able to do good things very quickly, but on the other hand, a bad person will be able to ruin the country in no time flat. Whatever you do, just slowing stuff down makes everything much more stable, and stability is something that the economy really likes. Stability is something that even individual citizens really like, usually. Regardless of what kind of institutions you have, like this democracy idea has the advantage of slowing stuff down more than most other systems, right? Because you have to consult the people for a fair few things, like amending basic human rights and that kind of stuff. People have a certain amount of power to influence the system, both in a direct and indirect way, so with voting and with stuff like referenda. Democracy is this ultimate slowdown mechanism, and the more democracy you have, I guess I shouldn't say that, because if you would have a direct democracy, you would be able to enact fast change. So a pure democracy where everybody has a say in everything, I guess that's not a good thing either. But these in between systems with 3 layers of parliament and other government institutions as well that slow everything down, those are, in this way of thinking about it, are a good thing.
Well, there's one thing I would add to that, is that not all big changes come through government. And so you could see how lots of people, the popular phrase again, is to try to change things from outside of the system.
Yes.
Like, ooh, outside.
Yeah.
But there are very powerful organizations and corporations that can make very big differences. And whenever we enact freedoms, that allows people to sort of exercise those freedoms and make very sweeping changes without any sort of buffer.
Yeah.
And so one thing you could say, that although democracy has this nice property of sort of slowing down change, when, say, any problems arise from things coming outside of the government, action that would be taken to sort of resolve those problems would also be slowed down.
Yeah, it's like an quote-unquote Achilles heel of democracy, that it's also fairly slow to adapt to sweeping changes, and that's stuff we see now. We see fast robotization of manufacturing and even jobs, just very, very large differences between...
Wait, are you moving outside of the abstract on me, Dem? You have to make up examples. I will not allow this.
Oh, sorry. So we see very large differences in how we used to raise unicorns versus how we... No, this is still too... No, sorry. No.
It's too real.
I'm an engineer. I have to keep it real. I have to... There are things that are happening very quickly, and it seems like, especially technological progress, is like squeezing the limits of how tenable these systems are. But in the same way, I would like to get back to this idea of stuff outside the system changing and enacting essentially more change than governments themselves. And that's also something that pertains to these ideas of big government versus small government, right? So here I guess I live in the perfect antipole of the United States. The United States has a relatively, well, it doesn't have small government, but it has a relatively small government in most parts of life. So that like half of the discretionary budget goes to military, but if you don't count that, so if you completely disregard the military part, then the US government is something like 20% of GDP. So it has like a 20% influence on your life, essentially. And
sure.
In the Netherlands,
I'm just gonna...
In the Netherlands, it's roughly 50% of GDP, right? So we have arguably a 2.5 times as large government. If you really, this is very fast and loose. Don't.
I'm not a fan of all of these numbers. When you take these fast and loose heuristics and then assign a value to them.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We'll just use X and Y, or alpha and beta. Where beta is 2.5 times alpha. Is that too concrete as well?
When you say beta equal, whatever.
So I just said that a government is there to slow down everything and arguably slow down progress, right? This is kind of inherent to this argument, and I'm not seeing that actually work out that way. I have to stay in concrete examples. So the US government, for instance, has been extremely slow to even ratify stuff like climate change, that it exists, and ratify any kind of action on it. And it has been very slow to all kinds of social changes, even though arguably the population isn't that different. They have most of the population has been pro all these controversial topics. I won't name them. For a very long time. And
You mean you won't name them again?
there has been public support, but nothing has been done. And kind of the converse happens here. There has been very rapid social and technological change, and even though we have a big and arguably inefficient government, because that's the argument, right? Big government is inefficient compared to markets. We live in, or I live in a country that has embraced stuff like autonomous driving and big social changes with the way we distribute income and wealth and that kind of stuff for the better, right? Measurably better than the way some other countries have done this. So there are these, my head is filled with these economic and political dogmas within certain frameworks, like big government is always worse and less efficient than a market and those kinds of dogmas. And I don't necessarily always see them playing out that way. I find that reality is very irregular, to use a math term for that. It doesn't behave analytically. And that makes it so hard to assign true, unambiguous meaning to this whole topic of everything from democracy to how governments work. I find it, the more I know about it, the more I'm hesitant to say there is something you can do very, very simply that makes it unambiguously better.
That gets down to one of my biggest issues, I guess, personally with politics. Is that, and this is not an issue that I have with politicians or things, it's just an issue I have more with me, is that on many, many issues, I can look at this and with the knowledge I've gained, I can really say, I do not know what is the correct course to go.
Totally.
And this is why I'm also very supportive of the idea of representative democracy, because it's like, I don't have time to figure out what's the right thing to do. But it also, just on very many fundamental questions, I find myself thinking about it for a very long time and just concluding, I do not know. Sometimes I get this sort of, I would say, saltiness with other people because it feels like everybody is purporting to know things that they don't know.
Yeah. Every topic that most people are familiar with, people tend to think they have this, what's it called? Cognitive easing is the term.
Yeah.
So if you for instance hear a word very often, then at some point you will say that word has meaning, even if it doesn't have. That's a very famous experiment. And the same goes for other ideas. If you hear a certain idea a lot of times, if it's being repeated very often, then at some point you will either subconsciously or subconsciously believe it to be true, even if the actual scientific evidence, for instance, is completely false. This is how stuff like alternative medicine works. This is how most things work. Arguably, this is how humans work.
I feel like over time in this podcast, you will make more and more enemies.
Yes, I will. But
and we will
I'm
go
fine
down
with that.
from 4 subscribers to 3, and then
that's pretty much how it went on YouTube. Unfortunately, this idea of cognitive easing, it works on politics, but also like nutrition is a big one where everybody seems to have an opinion, even if they don't actually know anything about it. Not anything like truly scientific, or if you don't subscribe to that, like no actual in-depth knowledge about stuff. But everybody has to eat, everybody has to pee, everybody has to do these
everybody
things.
Poops.
So everybody thinks they know everything about it. And the same goes for me and politics. I'm just saying stuff, and I think these things make sense, but you know,
I don't know, it's hard sometimes because sometimes there are like few kernels of issues that I feel like I actually understand and know the right answer. But every once in a while I will look at this thing and I'll be reading up, and then there will be chinks in what I think is the right idea. Most recently, this was with legalization of marijuana in the U.S., is that I've always been very pro legalization because of just all of the basically side effects to our criminal justice system of what happens. And I still am fairly pro legalization, but I'm just less enthusiastic about it, I guess, because there was this nice thing on 60 Minutes where they talked about how legalization, decriminalization of marijuana sales and possession affected the area. And like for some things, it was clear that it didn't reduce. Like a popular slogan was "Bring it out of the underground."
Yeah.
But in no way, shape, or form did it actually do that.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, the Netherlands, I guess, is a prime example of how to do things and how not to do things, I guess. We have decriminalized it. We have officially not legalized it. So, in a way, the U.S. is more liberal than the Netherlands in a lot of these issues. I have to say, yeah, it's a
Leaping lizards.
shock.
I know.
Shock and awe. Decriminalization of marijuana in the Netherlands has led to, for instance, better health outcomes, lower criminality around the subject. But at the same time, we never legalized it, and we never legalized production. So there is, I think it's one or two companies that make weed, which provide like 10% of the total demand in the Netherlands. So what do you guess happens? There are like 10 or 20 raids every week of illegal weed farms. Usually, like what they do is they go sit in a vacant lot or in just in a rental home, put in these sealed bags, all in the inside of the of an apartment or a house. Put a weed growing operation in there using stolen electricity, and then the hermetic seal makes sure that special dogs and these kinds of detection methods don't work from a distance. So they just try to grow a couple of seasons of weed, and then after a while the utility sees, oh well, there's a lot of electricity used there. It's probably a weed operation because that's the only reason that would happen.
Or someone's mining.
Or somebody is mining gold. Yes, that happens all the time as well. And so we have a giant problem with criminals illegally growing weed and disrupting residential neighborhoods in that way. It's not very overt. It doesn't cause serious open crime. That's okay, I guess. But like, seriously, US, if you want to learn anything about this, yes, legalization has measurable good side effects, but not just legalization has this. We have put so much money and effort into, for instance, street testing drugs for people for free, having national announcements when dangerous drugs like lethal substances are mixed or cut with the drugs. We have a lot of research into it. We've done so much more than just the decriminalization of weed, and arguably those other measures are the things that actually had a positive effect on society. And just the legalization or the decriminalization of weed use and possession hasn't done that much, and maybe has caused more crime in the background. So if you want to do it better than we did.
That's well, there's a popular sentiment in the US that who cares what those Europeans are doing? We do our own thing.
Sure. I don't disagree.
I don't think it's the right sentiment. You should always learn from.
You always have to learn from other people's mistakes, but that doesn't mean that always works out. Like, there are good arguments for why the US is so fundamentally different, and it is fundamentally different in a lot of ways to Europe.
With everything, you will never get your idealized parallel US to test things out.
Nope. Exactly.
And so take what you can, even if they are closer to heuristics than analysis than you would like. This is a little PSA. Learn from others' mistakes, people.
And stuff is complicated, always.
Yes.
There's no easy answers.
Stuff is not knowing what the right answer is. It's very okay. but it is also very frustrating.
Yep.
Moving on, there's something that we used to talk about a little more before the podcast, but hasn't really made it into the podcast much. That is education. I know there are some plans in the work, but
Edumacation.
let's just start with a very simple. I always think it's like, oh, this will be a short topic, but
Yeah, education is it's simple, right? It's
yeah, you learn the thing. Good.
yeah, you learn the thing and then you know the thing, right?
Actually, this is very directly, I tell you the thing and then hopefully you know the thing. What do you think about the most popular form of education in universities, which is the lecture?
It's my main gripe with, let's just call it what it is in a broad sense, like class-based learning. One person talking in front of an audience of tens or maybe even 100 students, and then expecting those students to copy that information into their brains. That type of learning, like, I don't, not to brag, I don't mean to brag at all, but I've been like the bad effect of this kind of teaching, which is the brighter students, they get bogged down by the slow students, and they eventually get disinterested and disenfranchised with the system. Essentially stop learning, stop engaging with the material and doing other stuff. And that's exactly what happened with me in a big way. Even though I always had very good grades, I was never really engaged with most of the material. Even in university, I found that the pace of most of the lectures was fairly slow. People don't advance, like the school system and university is based on this idea that everybody advances at the same rate at the same age. So people learn the same things at the same age, but that's not how it works.
Civs, I mean, there are things like the admissions process and just sort of different levels of classes. There are these civs around.
Oh, right, yeah. So university works a bit different in Europe.
Yeah. Tell me about it. I mean,
well, arguably in the US, it's a little bit more of a merit-based system. So you do need to do admissions. You are selected, especially in the better universities. I know there are quote-unquote free universities where you are admitted if you have the just the prerequisite education level and not necessarily good grades. But in the Netherlands and a lot of Europe, I guess, everywhere where there is free tuition, essentially. You can just go to university if you had what is our equivalent of high school at the right grade level, and you passed it. So it's called VWO in the Netherlands.
A little bit of a civ.
It's VWO is a high school. If you do the literal translation, it's called Preparation for University Education. And that's what you get between like 11 and 17 years old. And that education, if you finish that, you can go to university. And you can go to any university. So, and that is fundamentally different from the US, which has, like here,
It is fairly different.
The universities are pretty much all, if you go by percentiles, all the universities are top 2% or 98th percentile, whatever you want to say. And in the US, some universities are what we consider a lower level of education. There are, I think it's 93rd percentile universities in the US that do stuff like MBAs, which are not considered universities here.
It seems like most people here don't know the difference between a university and a college. And I wouldn't either if I wouldn't know either if my dad didn't work at a university. Also, this is just a different nomenclature is difference that in America everybody says college. Whatever it is, university, just a college.
Yeah.
It's you go to college. And a lot of our classes are in high school are called college preparatory. So
Yeah.
They're, yeah, parallels.
We increasingly have a high school-like system, but we still have different education grades. You go to a whole separate institution with separate class types for different end goals of your education. So there is vocational education on different levels.
Yeah.
So we have lower, middle, and higher vocational education. And then we have university. And all of those have these preparatory schools, I guess, that you go to. Essentially, you're locked into the system at age 11. And in the United States, I guess, you have your majors, your minors, and your preparatory classes. But you all go to the same quote-unquote high school, sort of. This is very confusing if there are listeners that are not familiar with the fact that there's so big a difference between systems.
Oh, there is one thing, is we can just talk about doctor things in general.
I enjoy that very much for a simple reason, because I'm
which is
currently writing blogs, and the current blog that I'm writing on is about healthcare systems.
That just a complete side note. One of my favorite YouTube channels is Healthcare Triage.
I was hoping you would say that. The guy is awesome. The guy is a bit shouty. Like
I like the guy, but the reason I most like it is just the quality of the material.
Yeah.
And content is king.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's right there. It's something. It's a source that I really, really trust, which is hard to find.
And he cites his sources, and he almost always takes them from JAMA, which has a pretty good consensus. Yeah. So it's awesome.
And I think the core reason is because he's actually, health researcher. And so this is why we need the researchers making these shows, guys. Quality goes ways up.
I am so annoyed with healthcare now, but that's just because I've been reading about it and talking with people about it and realizing that people put a lot of trust in healthcare professionals that is not really justified, I guess. This is a very, very treacherous subject.
This feels like it's almost drawing analogs to trusting representatives, but anyways.
Healthcare professionals, so I'm specifically talking about doctors, MDs, and...
Do you mean nurse practitioners?
Nurses, yeah. So doctors and nurses often have either sob stories or specific grievances. Those don't necessarily correlate with either the consensus, the research, or reality. It's often anecdotal evidence that people really like. People really like these stories. The problem is that often just completely evades the current best research on certain subjects, specifically on healthcare policy.
I am going to use anecdotes to challenge your to challenge your opinion on anecdotes. I've seen many doctors in my day because I have, I guess, a couple of chronic illnesses.
You're a cripple, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
But actually, a sidetrack with the illnesses, it does flare up fairly often.
Mm-hmm.
So in the last 2.5 weeks, I haven't gone bouldering once because I've just been more ill.
Sucks, man.
It does suck, but you do get used to it. It's like people can't fly. That sucks.
Yeah.
But what I found is that most of doctors I have seen have been very to the research. And so, I don't know. I guess I just don't see that so much. But maybe I'll write a counter blog.
No, sure. No, the issues I'm specifically talking about, for instance, is in the Netherlands we have a fairly expensive healthcare system. The government is trying everything. It has literally tried the kitchen sink, I'm sure, to try to combat rising healthcare costs. And the awesome thing about this is that it actually works. But it's very hard to convince people of this because, so two things. We don't have a single payer system. We have socialized medicine, but not quite. very hard to explain the differences to Americans, I'm sure, because you've heard a lot of things, especially during the election, about single payer, which is the Canadian model. We don't quite have that, but essentially what it boils down to, everybody here pays a relatively small premium of about 1,000 euros a year, and you get pretty much full basic medical coverage. So whatever happens, that if there's something serious and you end up in hospital, you almost have to pay nothing. If you have to go to your GP, there's no charge at all. If you need medicine, it's very cheap or free. There's this annual fee that everybody has to pay. Everybody who lives in the Netherlands, even homeless people, everybody has to pay about 1,000. It starts at just under 1,000 euros, and some premiums, like the better packages, you can get additional insurance for all kinds of, like dental care, that kind of stuff. You pay a little bit more, but it's never over like 2,000 euros a year. That is slightly rising. So next year, for instance, every year your healthcare costs rise with like a couple of euros a month. So that's what people see, right? That's people say, oh, healthcare is getting more expensive every year.
Well, you convinced me.
Sure. This is what people see. This is what they also feel in their wallet. They think, oh man, healthcare is getting really expensive. But it's not, because it's still only like half the cost of the US and much less than a lot of our neighbor countries. And we have fairly advanced healthcare and healthcare costs on the whole, because obviously those premiums are not all the costs. Also, a significant part of healthcare costs are paid directly by the government in some way or shape or form. So some of your taxes go toward this as well, and those costs are actually going down slightly. So on the whole, healthcare costs have stayed the same since 2011, even though we have this aging problem. So more aging people means higher healthcare costs. So the government has been trying and been reasonably successful at least keeping the costs level, while most other countries have sharply rising costs. But that is a very long way to explain what most people will just do away with by saying, no, but this year I am paying more than last year, so costs are rising. And it's very frustrating to...
Well, how do you motivate that the amount of tax revenue going towards these systems is decreasing? Some of my chair part has just came back to haunt me. I fell backwards.
I have now followed up.
No, I just like sharply fell back. I was like, whoa. You have to think, if that is what people see the direct cost rising, and they don't see the tax cost decreasing.
Yep.
But you have to explain, why is it that not the case that they just move the money around and the amount of taxes that goes to it stays constant and their premiums don't rise?
This is just why it's so hard. The way I've come to explain this to people is something pertaining to a quarter of our GDP is bound to have lots of nuances and complexities in it. And it's pretty much impossible to explain all of it. Even saying that healthcare costs have stayed the same as a percentage of the GDP over the last 5 years, that is a gross oversimplification in so many ways. Like you can call me on this and say, well, I'm lying. And in a certain way, I am leaving a lot of nuances just to what they are.
It does sound like your argument is, don't think about it. It's okay.
But that's the point, right? I really like people to think about this because it's unique. And it seems like through a massive amount of trial and error and lots of failures, let me just be clear about this, our healthcare system is not perfect in any way. But through a lot of experimentation and fairly methodical tries, there is this kernel of optimism that I have for our healthcare system. And the reason why I'm saying this is because we also have a populist candidate who has been very vocal about a couple of also, by the way, actually factually inaccurate qualms about our healthcare system. He hasn't been very decisive about this, but a couple of parties in our country have been like, well, our entire healthcare system has to change and we have to go back to what's called the Bismarck system, which was what we had before. Because people remember from the 90s, from before we changed our healthcare system, that premiums were very low. And a lot of people only had to pay like 25 euros a month to be insured. Like, that is true. Like, unequivocally, that's true. But you have to add to that, number one, healthcare costs were so much lower back then. Number two, lots more people were working and paying for it, and a lot less people were old and not paying for it. And number three, probably the biggest one, the healthcare was not universal. So a lot of people were uninsured or underinsured. So if you add all that together and you actually look at if we would change our healthcare system back to the Bismarck system, costs would actually rise or at least stay the same, and quality of care would be less. But yeah, again, these are things that are so hard to explain in full.
Healthcare is
It's super complex.
very tough. Not just to explain, but even just to understand a little bit of it.
People in the US calling for a single-payer healthcare system. Like, I laud the efforts to try to fix which is something that is definitely the most broken healthcare system in the world.
Yeah.
There is nobody who would say anything else. Like, even Cuba has better healthcare. Whatever. It's good that people are calling for change, but naming these specific things, it's like, what would be a good analogy?
Naming what specific things?
Like saying specifically we want single-payer healthcare.
Yeah.
Without demonstrating a full knowledge of what that actually entails. Because single-payer isn't necessarily good. There are some real serious drawbacks to a single-payer system, and that's, for instance, what you see with the NHS in the UK, and to an extent, the Canadian system as well. You have very long waiting lists for a lot of things, and relatively poor basic healthcare, especially as the aging problem comes in, and governments are afraid to raise taxes or co-pays. You really run into serious trouble with those systems, trouble which is very similar to what the US already has. And imagine the US saying, okay, we're going to a single-payer healthcare system, and then 5 years later, when aging is at its worst, so the least people are working for the most people who are old, and then people still not receiving good care, still going bankrupt on medical bills, and then they say, well, we changed to this better system, which was supposed to be utopia. What happened? And then you have to explain, well, maybe we should have gone to a different system, and let's overhaul it again. And oh God.
Sometimes what I see with these things is you have to do the best you can do. I heard a great name for class of algorithms called PAC algorithms. It's more of a paradigm than a class. And PAC, PAC, stands for probably approximately correct. And it just feels so just downtrodden. It's like somebody comes to you, it's like, okay, you have the algorithm? He's like, yes. It's like, does it give the correct solution? Well, it gives an approximately optimal solution. It's like, but always gives an approximately optimal solution. Well, probably it gives an approximately.
So this is for indeterminate stuff, or for like NP hard problems that you want to approximate?
Very often it is, but also for many just big data things, you want sublinear algorithms.
Right, yeah.
Or property testing for big data things. This case also often intersects with the NP-hard case, which is simulation. It's sort of downtrodden, but that's how we make all of our decisions on a day-to-day basis. Is that we go for probably approximately correct. And I think a lot of times with people going for who support single payer is that it's hard to see that something will be fix all, but the idea is that hopefully it will make it better.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. And I'm again, I have to reiterate myself. The more I think about this stuff, the less of I'm putting out these very rigid opinions. Like before I said, I kind of implied that alternative medicine was bad. And already I'm thinking, I've seen research about this. That is not a very well motivated stance on the subject, and there is
It's not.
there are good reasons for people to want to use, and there's like higher than placebo type effects on some things. So, I shouldn't have said that. It's everything is complex, and you have to.
It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
We forgive you, Dem.
No.
They're there.
No, there are going to be comments.
They're there.
No,
Thank
no,
you
that's not how.
Sharing.
That's not how it
sharing
works.
with the circle.
People start typing before you actually say the thing, and then they just leave a
asterisk. Oh, I can't read that. No.
No, they just leave it blank where they start typing some angry comment, a la internet comment etiquette, which is the third recommendation for a YouTube channel.
Yes. I would put my top recommendation definitely with gold stars, healthcare triage. All the subs.
I think Big Money Salvia requires all the subs, and maybe after that.
I was just going for what is relevant to today's podcast.
I don't know. I think he's relevant as well. Like he does pod. We talked about pod. I think that qualifies.
Good enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on that positive note of everything can be solved analytically in the best possible way, I hope everybody enjoyed this monologue of me with Rio sometimes interjecting and me talking over him.
Yeah.